We are living in a two-speed reality. On one track, we are seeing the vicious impacts a warming planet can have on nature and humans through wildfires, floods, droughts, and more. On the other track, we are finally seeing bigger and bigger portions of society accepting the scale of the challenge ahead of us and clamoring for action. In the past few years, especially, young people have raised their voices like never before. Be that Greta Thunberg, Louisa Neubauer, Vanessa Nakate, or the millions of students going on school strikes every Friday. Or be that the young people under the banner of the Sunrise Movement in the US who have made the Green New Deal central to the conversations on climate solutions. To understand how this came about and where it might lead us, it's my great pleasure to introduce Varshini Prakash, a co-founder of the Sunrise Movement and the co-editor of a new book of essays titled Winning the Green New Deal, Why We Must and How We Can. Varshini, let's start at the beginning. You weren't particularly interested in politics growing up, and now you're helping reshape the priorities of the Democratic Party. Could you give us a quick recap of how you got here?
Yeah, when I was younger, I didn't care about politics at all. In fact, I would say I had a deep aversion to politics. I wanted nothing to do with it. I didn't understand how it could actually help communities that I saw suffering so deeply from environmental degradation and also climate change. But as I got older, I started to realize if I wanted to change the world at the scale required to truly tackle problems like the climate crisis, I had to see politics, I had to see government, particularly the federal government, as one of the greatest tools at our disposal for helping the greatest number of people, and an essential component of how we engage in a massive society-wide economic transformation towards a renewable energy economy. And so, I became an activist in college and helped run and lead the fossil fuel divestment movement across the country that was working to get universities and colleges and institutions around the country and the world to stop investing in fossil fuel companies. And then in 2016 and 2017, started putting together the team that eventually became the founders of Sunrise Movement. And yeah, the rest is history.
The Sunrise Movement has a three-pronged approach to changing what you call the status quo. Could you explain what it is and why it seems to be working?
Yeah, so the three-pronged approach, what we call our theory of change, consists of three things. One, people power. Two, political power. And three, political alignments. The first component of that, people power, it's what you see when you see millions of young people striking in the streets. It's grassroots lobbying, it's organizing, and it's essentially the protest organizing and civil disobedience. But at its root, people power is building a vocal and active and at times disruptive movement of young people for Sunrise, but also just people in general who are calling for the change that we need. Political power is about electing a new generation of politicians to office who not only vote the right way, but actually believe in their heart and soul in the mission of tackling the climate crisis and passing a Green New Deal. We want champions that don't necessarily just have, a D next to their name, but people who will go to bat, who will maybe take risks to their career to ensure that the climate crisis is at the top of the political agenda in the United States. And the last approach is called political alignments. Essentially, for the last 40 years in U.S. politics, our economy and our policies have been governed by an ideology and a value system that is deeply based in individualism, in sort of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, that if you are struggling, if you are poor, if you are Black, that it is your fault. And that, our government and our society has no duty to help you. And that has led to a whole bunch of issues of disinvestment in the public sector, of deregulation of industry, and a sense that, our public institutions don't have responsibility in protecting citizens, but in actuality, leaving all of that up to the markets, which has led to one of the worst levels of inequality that we have seen in a century in the United States and even around the world. And so we need a new alignment. We need a new set of values, a new ideology that governs policy that seeps into virtually every aspect of governance and policy making at all levels. And that is actually based in values of justice and dignity, equality, care for all people, which would be a vastly different set of policies than we have seen in recent memory in the United States. And really, we need all of these different parts of our theory of change to work together. We can't just have a subset of people that are shaking their fists on the outside, but doing so to politicians who don't share our values. At the same time, we know that politicians are often deeply responsive to public will. And so we can't just elect the right people. We also have to cultivate the political conditions outside of Congress and outside of the White House to ensure that our politicians take the right course of action. So that's why we need all of those pieces together.
One thing I did is in my newsletter, I asked people to send in questions that they could ask you. And one question that came up was that it's been clear from recent elections that old people vote in much greater number than young people do. Mm-hmm. Do you think it'll be different this time around in the 2020 US presidential election?
I think it very well could be. I think what's exciting about this moment is that young people, and what I mean by young people is pretty loose term, like millennials are, 40, 42. But millennials and Gen Z make up the biggest political voting bloc in the United States. And so that really means that if young people vote, and we know that young people care about the climate crisis across political parties in super majorities. If young people vote, there is a very good chance that we could elect a Congress and a president that understands the climate science, refuses to engage in sort of willful and frankly criminal levels of denialism like the current president, and it could change the course of history. The challenge is going to be like, are we actually reaching those young people and turning them out and supporting them to vote in this election when it's going to be far more complicated than a usual election? But stats are showing that young people in super majorities, especially in swing states, are very much planning to vote and are ready to engage. I think it's just a question of, are we actually helping them get out and creating those touch points, which, Sunrise, but lots of other organizations are also taking responsibility for.
So do you think that this lack of political alignment is the reason why young people have not turned out in the numbers that we would expect them to turn out if it was just averages across all ages? And as you said, the choice, if you care about climate change, is very clear in this election. So in Biden, do young people have a candidate that they would feel like taking this extra step of actually voting and maybe voting for the first time?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we always knew it would be an uphill battle. Like, it was abundantly clear that the Democratic candidate that young people were getting behind in the primary was Bernie Sanders, by far and away. It was clear that Joe Biden was the candidate that older folks were rallying behind, and Bernie Sanders certainly had the youth vote as well as the Latinx vote and other demographics. And I think we have to. I think some of the changes that Joe Biden has made to his policies in recent months may contribute to young people feeling more excited about him as we get closer to the election. For example, I was a part of a task force with Bernie Sanders as well as, Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden kind of unity task force that came together to align on policy a couple of months ago. And through this process, we were able to improve Joe Biden's plan considerably. We made advancements such as moving the timeline by which around decarbonization of the power sector from 2050 to 2035. He now has a $2 trillion green jobs and infrastructure plan where 40% of that investment will be going directly to communities of color and low-income communities. That plan now includes the expansion of indigenous rights so that the crises around the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Keystone XL pipeline that have really took the country by force over the last few years never happen again, where you're seeing pipelines that were previously supposed to be routed through white communities, then being routed through indigenous communities. Because indigenous communities have so much less, have been disenfranchised and have so much less political power in this country because of the centuries of genocide and that have taken place. And so, I think that reality coupled with the ways in which, Joe Biden has been responding to these fires by making, a 25-minute first time ever speech by a Democratic candidate on the climate crisis alone, compared to, Donald Trump, who is saying that, the science doesn't know what it's talking about, and that, alleging that we will enter a cooling period, which is just absolutely preposterous and upsetting on so many levels. And I think people are seeing the stark difference between the candidates more than ever. And I think that could really put Joe Biden in the lead, particularly with young people who care about this issue so much.
Right. And, we talked about people power and we talked about political power. I think this is a good time with, you bringing up the decarbonization of the power grid as a policy that Joe Biden might bring in if he's elected, to talk about technology changes. One of the questions, again, that came from the audience was, where do you stand on nuclear power, which is a zero carbon source of electricity and could make the process of getting to a carbon neutral grid by 2035 much easier or cheaper because you have nuclear power in the mix?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a question we get a lot. Our sort of stance as Sunrise Movement is we support a policy that's essentially no new nuclear, but where nuclear would otherwise be replaced by fossil fuels if you were to shut it down, obviously that is only taking us backwards. And the reason why is essentially, we can't actually deploy, first of all, nuclear is expensive and not actually as cheap to deploy as other renewable energy technologies that are getting cheaper and cheaper by the day. And also, we need to deploy this at scale quickly over the next decade. And a lot of these nuclear facilities take years and years to actually get up and running. And so for that reason, our position is no new nuclear, but, obviously don't want it to be replaced by other polluting technologies.
Right. And similarly, if we go beyond 2035, there would be sectors of the economy that have no option in decarbonizing, but using technologies such as carbon capture. So say it's cement industry, which, even if it stops using fossil fuels, because of the chemical process in which calcium carbonate is converted into calcium oxide, and then it's converted into cement, you get the production of CO2. Have you thought through how carbon capture might fit in this goal to reach net zero by 2050?
Yeah. It's certainly, I think, pursuing and advancing and doing R&D for technologies that can do carbon capture in quick, in a far cheaper manner than what we have currently, and also in a sort of not the terrifying like mirrors in the sky kind of thing, for sure. I think that the question here is, we've got to make sure that if we are pursuing carbon capture technologies, that we're not doing so as an excuse to allow the fossil fuel industry to continue to pollute. Because not only is climate change a problem, but we actually have a lot of particularly poor communities, particularly Black and brown communities, who are fence line communities, and that they live in very close proximity to polluting refineries and plants and wells that have contributed to the degradation of human health considerably, and particularly along racial and class lines. And so this can't be an excuse for the fossil fuel industry to continue to pollute and continue to sort of protect their bottom line, saying, okay, we'll suck it out of the atmosphere somewhere else. Definitely support research and development on CCS in such a way that if we get to the point where we've deployed everything we can, we've done everything in our power, and we've still polluted too much and have to take things out of the atmosphere over the next coming decades, definitely support that research, but want it to be done in a just and equitable way. And I would also say, I mean, there's a lot more that we could be doing in using the natural environment as a carbon sink. Right now, agriculture is a huge opportunity to be using, working alongside farmers to really create sustainable agriculture practices that utilize farms as carbon sinks rather than carbon sources. We could be preserving many, many, many more millions of acres of land than we currently are. There are a lot of studies that show out there, just using these natural climate solutions could get us a significant way towards decarbonization. And so I'd like to see all of those kind of be exhausted before we start to get at technocratic sort of silver bullet solutions.
Yeah. And, these technology conversations, which, happen in certain parts of society, may not always filter through to the voter. So when you're going out and canvassing and trying to rally crowds, what types of questions come up? Maybe 3 questions that are very commonly asked when you're saying vote for us or follow the Green New Deal. And it doesn't have to be just from young people, but anybody who hears of Sunrise Movement.
Like questions about the Green New Deal or questions about Sunrise?
Yeah, questions about the Green New Deal or questions about the solutions to solve climate change. I mean, we've talked about technology solutions, right? Nuclear and carbon capture, but are there other types of solutions that people bring up, or even worries that people might bring up to you?
Yeah. I would say the top line worries that people bring up are, things that they hear on the news that are fallacies, but are sort of perpetuated, oftentimes by the right wing. And so we've got our work cut out for us to continue to beat back against that narrative. One of the things that we hear is people saying, oh, well, I've heard that it's very expensive and that we can't make it happen because it might cost people too much. And to that we say, well, the truth is, if we continue with business as usual, the consequences are almost too terrifying to imagine, and that the costs of inaction actually far, far outweigh the costs of taking action to stop the climate crisis. We also hear about sort of the political sort of impracticality of it because Republicans are climate deniers, and people like Mitch McConnell will never go for a Green New Deal. And that's exactly true. And that's part of why we really double down on talking about this isn't just about having the right policies. You've got to also have a plan of action to win. And part of that plan of action has to involve both electing climate champions that really support the Green New Deal, but it also involves kicking out Republicans who have been receiving millions of dollars in fossil fuel donations, which is a large reason, probably the biggest reason for why there's even such a concept as climate denialism. Most of these individuals know that the climate crisis is happening, but they have, donors, wealthy donors like the Koch brothers, who have in large part paid out millions and millions of dollars to willfully confuse the public and mislead the public on the validity of the science of the climate crisis. So those are some of the things. And also just kind of another one that I hear is, which I actually think is a problem that the environmental movement and the climate movement actually created themselves, is that we have posited the climate crisis and tackling the climate crisis as in the frame of like pain and punishment. And so, it's always been about taxation or stopping having to do things that you really enjoy doing. And I think what's exciting about the Green New Deal, and when we talk to people about the vision of it, people get excited because it's actually about an investment in a collective project that betters the lives of everyday Americans. When we talk about how it actually can reduce our energy bills, it will create jobs. It will not it would actually be a boost to the economy. It will be something that actually reinvigorates, creates further green spaces and creates all this like cool, awesome public transportation that is fast and frequent. It's about making farming and agriculture sustainable and a sustainable livelihood, which currently it is not. It's about ensuring that every person in every community in the United States has access to good, nutritious local food. So, when you actually paint the picture of the positive vision and the way in which the Green New Deal will better the lives of people, rather than it being about punishing folks for the way that they live, you see a very different reaction.
Right. Change doesn't have to be a bad thing. It can be a
No,
good thing.
not at all. Not at all.
And so, of course, this Sunrise Movement is in the US and is trying to change the politics, as we talked about, in the US. But how have you interacted with other young people around the world who are also clamoring for action? And yes, there might not be as much climate denial in other places, but there's still inertia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say so. The most we have done sort of on an international level has been through participating deeply in the climate strikes. And unfortunately, we were getting set to turn out millions of young people to the climate strikes on April 22nd. But of course, the pandemic hit, and so all of that was canceled. I will say I actually think this is a pretty big gap for Sunrise. I don't think we have deep networks of relationships internationally with other youth climate activists. And we know of people like Greta Thunberg and others, who are leading efforts in the UK or in Australia. But truth be told, we don't really have strong relationships with leaders in the global South or just on a macro level, connections, period, to cross-pollinate and share ideas. And so I'd be really curious, actually, what your thoughts are on this, because I know you've thought about it a lot and talked to tons of activists around the world. But I think this is a place that Sunrise could do better. And I think our work has influenced a lot of people around the world. And we have been deeply influenced by both, existing and movements of our past around the world. But I think there's always room for further connections.
Yeah, my sense has been that there is a very clear division between two types of economies. So rich and poor economies have very clear division in how the activism happens, and then democracies, or at least freer countries versus autocracies or less free countries, have a very difficult time with activism. Again, neither is surprising, but that gap hasn't been bridged. Activists from either divides haven't talked to each other about what works and how they could push the status quo in the sort of environment they find themselves in. But certainly from a reader's perspective, it feels like this is one thing, which it clearly isn't. And that's something that I think is fascinating, because as we all know, climate solutions are going to have to be global, and we'll need much more coordination between countries, probably not just at a governmental level, but also at a people level, which helps us, expand our empathies. Right. I'm going to ask you a very final question because we have 1 minute left. You have a new puppy. What's been what's the most difficult thing about having the puppy at home? And Does that give you any lessons for how people should think about children and young
Oh,
pets?
I love my puppy, and my cat is also staring at me right now. But I love having a puppy. The hardest thing about having a puppy is that she has two states of being, either running around the house and being a terror or sleeping. And she just absolutely loves to chew on everything that she can get her mouth on. And so she's always active, but honestly, it is the thing that I need in the midst of this pandemic.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for the conversation, Varshini.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here.